Back in 2020, I had a dream, and that dream was to build a 4K gaming PC. But unfortunately that didn't happen because of the GPU crisis, and we just couldn't get hold of parts, particularly at decent prices. So I stuck with the machine that I had. But today everything changes because I've managed to be able to collect all of the parts that I would have built that system out of. And we're going to see if I would have actually been able to play at 4K, and also, more importantly, how long would it have lasted me. So for those of you that don't watch the channel often, my home gaming PC is technically just a games console. I'm not into high FPS gaming. I generally play older titles and new AAA titles that are single player campaigns. So I'm not interested in 200 frames per second. I am happy with 60 FPS, but I do like to increase those graphical details up to the highest of settings, and that includes the resolution of 4K. But before we jump into the performance hardware that we're going to be building the system out of today, let's take a look at some of the things that we're going to include into that build that didn't come from that year. For the case, we're going to be using the Deepcool CG580. Now, at the time of filming, this case isn't actually available on their website yet, but it is a pretty clean example of a fish tank style case. It is something that is more than big enough to be able to build all of our components in, and it's going to look pretty smart too. For the power supply, we've also got the Deepcool PX1000P. That is a 1000 watt, 80 plus platinum power supply, way over the top for the system that we're going to build. But again, it is a pretty cool unit, and it's going to give us plenty of space for upgrading later. And then for the CPU cooler, we've got the Deepcool Mystique 360 ARGB. Now that is an all-in-one water cooler that is going to be more than enough for the CPU, and with its digital display, it's gonna look absolutely epic in the system too. Like I say, these components are not actually from 2020. They are pretty new, but I'm going to be using them anyway because I think they look pretty cool. And I need to thank Deepcool for sending them across to us and sponsoring the video today, because this stuff is going to look pretty epic as a system. When it came to the performance hardware, of course, to play in 4K, you needed to go big, and I would have used a platform similar to this. This is an MSI B550 Gaming Plus. I was big into the Ryzen processors back then, so I would have picked a board up like this. I do love these kind of models boards. I've had them on different sockets, and they always seem to offer plenty of features for a great price. These would have cost around £150 back then, and they would have offered everything that I would have needed to build the system, and they would have supported the CPU that I would have wanted too. And when it comes to that CPU, of course, we wanted to go big. So the CPU that I wanted was this one here. This is the Ryzen 9 5900X. It was a great CPU back in the day, mostly targeted to productivity tasks, but it offered you 12 cores, 24 threads, and a base clock speed of 3.7 gigahertz. A lot of people actually purchased these, even though they were a little bit expensive, and I didn't pick this up, even though they were available back then, because I just couldn't get a graphics card. And without the graphics card, the whole build just didn't make sense. So I finally managed to get hold of one, and they are still pretty decent today. Now, of course, to finish off the platform, we need RAM and storage, and here is one I built earlier. This is the B550 motherboard from the box that you saw previously, and it does look pretty nice once it's all laid out. We've already got our Ryzen 9 5900X pre-installed into the motherboard, and then for the RAM, we've got 4 sticks of 8GB of G.Skill Trident Z RGB. Now, this is the RAM that I really wanted back then because you guys were always showing it off in your builds. I probably had something that wasn't RGB back then, and I just managed to fill the slots to get it to run, but this is the one that I always wanted, and I've managed to get 4 sticks of this. It's going to look fantastic. When it comes to storage, at the moment, we've currently got a 1TB Generation 4 drive installed into the top slot here of the NVMe's. This is going to be just used for our operating system, and because I just basically use the system as a games console, of course, we need a big storage when it comes to storing my games. So in the bottom slot here, we have a 2TB drive installed there. Those drives would have cost quite a bit back then, but nowadays they're pretty cheap and you can pick them up very cheaply and very easily as well. So that is a full platform, but of course we are missing something, and that is of course the graphics card. For the graphics card, I always wanted this one here, the AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT. This was actually released in that year, but you just couldn't get hold of one unless you wanted to pay scalper prices. Due to the mining boom hitting and everything just going out of stock, I never actually managed to get hold of this card, and I actually did want the reference model, which is exactly what we've got here. It was just that if I didn't have the graphics card, there was no point building the rest of the system, so I stuck with what I had and stuck to the 1080p and 1440p resolution. But if we actually put this stuff together, could we have played all of the games that I wanted to play in 4K? Well, let's build a system and find out. So the system is built and everything seems to be working fine. Of course, I wouldn't have had the case and the power supply and the cooler back in 2020, but it does look amazing. The LCD display on the cooler is actually currently telling me my CPU temperature, which is pretty cool, running at 24 degrees, but the cooler is a little bit noisy, so I do apologize if you can hear it because I totally forgot to set it up in the BIOS as I went through. But the system is working and everything is up and running. As I said before, back in 2020, I would have been building a system like this for 4K gaming, and I'm pretty happy with 60 FPS at that level. And there were 3 games specifically that I knew were coming out that I really wanted to play. When I did actually get around to playing them, I played them in 1440p, and I had to adjust a few settings because the system that I had previous to this one was a very basic system with a Ryzen 5 3600 and an RX 5700 XT, which did fine at the time, but you couldn't really get a 4K performance out of it. But could this one actually get it out of them? Well, those are the games that we're going to test, and we're going to start out with Back 4 Blood. Now, for anybody that hasn't played this game before, it's very similar to the original Left 4 Dead games, which were of course created by Valve, but this was much more demanding than those games. They were made a lot earlier than this. This was actually released in around 2021, so it would have definitely been a game that I would have wanted to play, and it is my type of game too. So you can play it in co-op, and you basically just go round to round, going through the levels, killing lots of hordes of zombies. But will this system be able to keep up with that, particularly in 4K? Well, let's head into game. If we go off to our settings, we'll see what we've got configured. Pop over to our graphics settings. We are currently running in 4K resolution. We are going to be enabling VSync somewhere. So we're going to be enabling VSync because I've actually set our capture device to 60 Hertz. So it should give us a very smooth experience at 60 FPS. And then when we come down to our quality settings, we're currently set in high. That would have been roughly where I'd have played this game, in that kind of setting. Although I think we probably could boost this up a little bit. I like high fidelity, so we could do that. I'm not a big fan of ray tracing. I'm not too bothered about that, but high quality, maybe ultra settings would work perfectly fine. But for now, let's leave it on high and see what it will do. Going back into the game, resetting some stats here, we can see that we are currently locked across the board in terms of frames per second and performance at 60 FPS. Of course, this is not a demanding scene in the game. We do need to get some enemies on the screen because that's when we're really going to see what is going on. So we'll head outside, get some zombies on the go. So we're going to kill some zombies now. We're killing these ones, and so far we are currently still locked at 60 FPS on average. Our 1% low has dropped a little bit down to 47 FPS, but the game is still reasonably smooth. Our frame time is kicking out at around 16 milliseconds, so that's not too bad. It's still giving us a smooth experience. So it's pretty clear to see that I could have played this game in 4K at the settings and performance that I like to play at, and it would have worked perfectly fine. We do get a little dip now and again down into the 40s on that 1% low, but generally it is sitting around an average of 50 frames per second, which is not bad at all and will provide a very smooth experience. Now that we know that this system can actually play Back 4 Blood in 4K with a high preset and still achieve 60 FPS on average with a pretty decent 1% low, let's take a look at the next game. Now, while we're loading in the next game, I'm sure you guys won't be surprised at this one because I've featured it many times on the channel before. It is a game that I waited nearly 11 years, nearly 13 years actually, from the original console release to play, and that is of course Dead Island 2. It will also give you a little bit of an insight into the type of games I like. I do like zombie survival type games, and they don't really make that many of them anymore, but when they do, they seem to be absolutely fantastic. This game also needs to pre-cache its shaders when it comes into the game, and this system with the 5900X actually just churns through them within seconds, so there's absolutely no issues there. But now that we're in game, we'll pop over to the options and we'll see what we've got configured. Go to our display settings. We're currently set to 4K. We're going to be enabling VSync, so we will turn that on, and then we'll pop all the way down to our advanced settings. And at the moment it is currently set in an ultra setting. The system has obviously chosen that, so let's stick to an ultra setting. I would like to bump games up as far as they can, so let's see if that actually gives us a pretty decent performance. We'll head back into the game and save those settings. Now, while we're in the game, we can see that again we are pretty locked on our averages here at 60 FPS, although our 1% lows have taken a little bit of a dip down to, well, they just hit 12 there, but you can't really feel it on the screen. Maybe you can if you just turn a little bit too sharp in there, but so far the game is actually playable and it looks absolutely stunning. I'm not sure what will happen once we actually get a lot of zombies on the screen. I'm sure that 1% low will actually cause us some issues. So before we continue, let's head back over to those settings and we'll turn the quality preset down to just a simple high preset. go back into game and save those changes, and we'll see if that actually improves things for us. Now we are getting a slightly higher 1% low here of around 38 to 36. It's not massively different, but it is feeling a little bit more smoother in the keyboard and mouse here. So I think this is actually quite playable for me. Somebody recently did suggest to me how to actually get this game to run a little bit better on those 1% lows, and I probably will take them up on that because I do love this game and I really like to play it in a very smooth kind of gameplay experience. Now we've got a zombie chasing us here, so let's just run away from him for a second, because I do want to know if we are locked at 60 FPS on the averages here, what would the maximum frames per second be? Could we get those 1% lows higher if we actually unlock that? So let's head over to our options and disable VSync. That should be the only thing that's holding us back here, so we'll save those changes and head back into game. Now as you can see, our average FPS has actually shot right up to around 71 frames per second, and our 1% lows have followed it as well. We currently get a 1% low of 42, and that is actually really making a difference here in terms of smoothness. We'll just kick that zombie away because they keep chasing us, but we'll find a fence to run through or something. The game is actually playing beautifully smooth at the moment. There is no issues at all. It's really looking good. Everything is really detailed. We've got no textures popping. We've clearly got enough VRAM. Our graphics card is currently running at around 97%, 98% utilization, whereas our CPU is kind of bored really. It's sitting at around 14%, but that's kind of what we like to see, a CPU that can really keep up with the graphics card. So I think this again is another win for this system. I would have been able to play this game in 4K at the settings that I like to play with the performance I like. So let's take a look at our third game. Now the third game in our test week today is Space Marine 2. For anybody that's played this game, they will know how demanding it is. It is completely different to the previous two, which were quite well optimized when they were actually released. This one not so much, but it has got better with a few updates. The original game came out way in the early 2000s. It was like something like 2001 or something like that, and it would play on pretty much anything, but this was a completely different picture. We're in the game now, and of course there's not a lot happening on the screen because we haven't got to any of the hordes yet. But if we head over to our settings, we'll see what we've got configured. We'll pop to our video settings here. We are currently running in 4K again, so that's just our native resolution at the moment. We don't have any kind of upscaling enabled. We've got FSR here, but we are running in a native resolution. Frame generation is currently on. I'm going to turn that off. I don't want frame generation. We're going to see what this can do without any kind of frame gen technologies, and maybe turn them on if we really need to. We go down to the quality preset, and it's currently set to a high. This is probably where I would have actually played this game anyway, because it looks fantastic even at this setting. So let's head back into game and see the performance that we're getting. Now, as we can see in the corner of the screen, this game does not perform as well as the others. Even in 4K with a high preset, we are getting an average now of around 38 frames per second with a 1% low of 35. The game is not that jittery, to be honest. It's quite smooth, but I'm sure once we get to some enemies, we will see a complete difference here. This is where games would have actually started to really test the system that I put together, and probably would suggest to me that I need to upgrade, particularly to play at the settings that I want to. But of course, you can actually lower the resolution, and I normally would do that because I can go to 1440p and everything would be fine. As long as I'm hitting 60 FPS and I have a high quality picture, I'm usually pretty happy, to be honest. But we'll continue on into the game and we'll see what happens once we hit some kind of enemies. Things are still looking okay at the moment. We're currently running at 37 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 33. There's some enemies around this corner here, so we'll just start shooting at them now. The metrics in the corner are not really changing too much. Everything seems to be quite stable and the game is reasonably smooth. I would say that we're probably getting a more like a console-like experience now, but of course, I don't want to drop the quality of the picture. I like to have good quality pictures and I like to run games in 4K too. So let's see if there's any fancy tools from AMD that can really help us out here. Popping over to the settings now, and we'll go to the video, we'll scroll down, and probably the best thing that we can do is actually just turn on frame generation. It's a technology that's available to us with systems like this. So let's turn it on. See what kind of performance we get. Going back into the game, we can see that our performance is now pretty much doubled here with frame generation enabled. We're currently getting an average of 60 frames per second, which is where I like to be, with a 1% low of 55. The quality of the picture doesn't look any different, although we have had a slight increase on our frame time here, which is to be expected, to around 19 milliseconds. That is still more than playable and smooth enough for me, particularly because I play on a controller. So I could have just used that option and still get away with a machine like this. There is a lot happening on the screen now, and we are still maintaining that. We just went down to around 52 frames per second, but the average is still working out to be about 55 with a 1% low of 49. So that just goes to prove that this game will actually play on a system like this in the settings that I like, although it did require frame gen to really kind of push it to that limit. So there we have it. My dream system of 2020 would have actually played all of the games that I wanted to play in the resolution and the settings that I like to play at, and I would have got the performance expected. When we do come to those newer titles like Space Marine 2, we will need to enable some extra tooling. So it's a good job that AMD actually created it and you can get away with it. But let's take a look at some other games that I would have played in between that kind of timeline and see if the experience would have been the same for them too. So the benchmarking of this system today has actually just shown me that if I had managed to build this exact system with the specifications that I wanted, I probably would have actually saved a ton of money, because since 2020, I've actually had 2 upgrades of my home system. Firstly, I went for a graphics card that I could get my hands on, which was the RTX 3070. And I also just upgraded my CPU to the 5600X. That was the first upgrade path that I did on both platform as well as graphics card, and it did me okay for a while, but it still couldn't push to those 4K resolutions. So once actually everything had calmed down in the industry and we could get graphics cards again, I decided to go back to an AMD graphics card. But at that point, the 7000 series was out and I went for a 7900 XT. Now that graphics card paired with the Intel Core 14900K that I have in my home system has been perfectly fine for 4K gaming, and that would be expected, but it did cost a lot to get there. A system like this back in 2020 would have cost quite a bit, but I would have made a big saving not having to upgrade those, or dual upgrade as I went along. The graphics card alone would have cost you around £600. The CPU would have been around £400. So it wasn't a cheap system to build, but I wish I'd have actually been able to do it. Now, anyway, that is an insight into the dream PC that I wanted back in 2020. Let me know in the comments what you think about this system. Do you have a very similar system, or are you still looking to upgrade to something like this? This system now is about 4 to 5 years old, but it is still performing exceptionally well, particularly in new titles. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, and I'm sure as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.